An open marketplace where anyone can come in and start a company, sell something, produce goods and services, and the only way you can get ahead is by doing better than your competition. How do you do better than your competition? You create better products. You become more efficient. You have better prices. In other words, you get ahead by creating goods and services that people want to buy in an open marketplace. They want to buy it in an open marketplace because it makes them better off, because your businesses are more efficient, more productive. Now, how do you get ahead? And that creates the dynamism of billions and billions and billions of different transactions that push ahead productivity and wealth creation and job creation. How do you get ahead in society without economic freedom? Well, you get ahead by restricting markets, by restricting people's ability to make choices. You get ahead by forcing people to buy or subscribe to whatever you're producing. In other words, you get ahead by making people worse off. And this limits society's ability to grow and produce prosperity and jobs, but it also creates a different dynamic. In an economically free society, where competitors are constantly pushing to improve the quality and productivity of their processes, you get ahead, as I said, by making people better off. In a society without economic freedom, you get ahead by making people worse off, by restricting their choices and markets. This changes the whole dynamic of society. So let's look at what has happened as worldwide markets have freed up. If you listen to the critics of free markets, they're going to tell you that free markets are awful things, that they produce poverty. They will tell you that free markets are not compatible with democracy. But let me ask you, can you think of a single nation that has a stable democracy that is not a free market economy? In fact, all stable democracies are free market economies, because if government controls the economy, then it controls your life and society as well. So let's look at what has happened since the end of the Second World War, and many nations have moved towards freer markets, and the world has moved to an open and free trading system. The age of global free trade, free markets, and economic freedom have brought huge improvements to humankind. But these improvements have been concentrated in the nations that have free markets. The improvements have spilled over. Just about everybody in the world is better off. Not everybody. There's North Korea and Cuba and Nicaragua. But most everyone is better off. But the people in nations with free markets have seen their quality of life improve immensely. So this is the level of global poverty since 1950, as free markets have increased around the world. And if you look at that, that's billions of people on that side Since the end of the Second World War, the global number of people trapped in the most extreme poverty has fallen from about 2 billion people to about 3/4 billion people. In other words, the level of global poverty in the era of free trade and free markets has been cut in half. But that's not the real miracle. Look what's happened to the world's population during that period. In 1950, 4/5 of the population of the planet Earth was trapped in the most extreme poverty. Today, it's about 1 in 10. That's an immense improvement in human well-being, going from 4 in 5 people trapped in extreme poverty to about 1 in 10. It's not good enough, but it's a massive improvement. And look which nations have gained most from it. This is a quartile chart. So on your left of the screen are the quarter freest nations in the world. On your right of the screen are the quarter least free nations in the world. Extreme poverty has just about disappeared in economically free nations. Less than 1% of the population in economically free nations suffers extreme poverty. In nations that lack economic freedom, about a third of the population is trapped in extreme poverty, and half the population is trapped in the next level, poverty head count of $3.20 a day. So that is a massive difference between free market economies and non-free market economies. Take a look at this. This is the income of the poorest 10% of the population. In free market economies, the poorest 10%, the average income of the poorest 10% is $15,000 US a year. That's actually 4 times the average income in Ghana. Imagine being poor and earning $15,000 a year. In the poorest nation, in the least free nations, the average income of the poorest 10% is about $2,000 a year. No wonder people flee from all over the world, whether from Asia, Africa, Latin America, nations with higher levels of economic freedom. Because even the poor in nations with high levels of economic freedom are far better off than people in non-free nations. This is global per capita GDP. In other words, the amount of GDP, gross domestic product per person. And as you can see, that too has grown hugely in the era of free markets and open trade. And the average per capita GDP in the quarter freest nations is $53,000 US. That's per person, average per capita GDP. In the least poor nation, in the least free nations, it's $6,500. A huge difference. Literacy. This is going to look a lot like the poverty charts. In 1950, there were about 1.25 billion people who were literate. That has dropped to about 1 billion. Again, much better, but not good enough. And this is what's happened to the world's population. We've gone from a world in which 2/3, 2 out of 3 people were illiterate, to a nation in which only about 1 in 8 are illiterate. And again, the gains are highest in nations with free market economies. In the most free market nations, 95% of men and 94% of women are literate. In the least free nations, only 75% of men and only 60% of women are literate. Now notice 2 things. The first is, of course, that literacy is much, much higher in free market economies. The second is that the gap between men and women, boys and girls, virtually disappears in free market economies. Life expectancy in years has risen dramatically from about 48 years to over 70 years during this period. But look where the gains of life expectancy are the greatest. In the least free nations, life expectancy is only 66 years. In the most free nations, it's over 80 years. By the way, I'm very glad that I was born in Canada an economically freest nation. Because were I born in an unfree nation, my life expectancy would already be passed. So this is a nice bonus. A couple last things. Many critics of free markets will say, oh, well, okay, maybe free markets do produce prosperity, but how could anybody be happy in a free market economy? As a matter of fact, sociologists who are not known for their free market attitude, sociologists have done a number of studies on global happiness, and they have found a very strong and positive correlation between economic freedom and life satisfaction, life happiness. As it turns out, people like to be free to make their own decisions. They don't want crony capitalists or government making decisions for them. And when people make their own decisions, they are happier. This is a marvelous finding. Another thing is economic freedom helps crush corruption. When you aren't economically free, and there's somebody to ask permission to do something, there's somebody to give money to. If government is huge and unaccountable, and the project that's being launched here today is marvelous, when government is huge and unaccountable, there are favors to hand out and favors to request. But if government is small and accountable and a society is economically free, the power of government to hand out favors is limited, and the number of people you need to ask permission to do something is limited, so corruption withers. And here you can see the relationship. Average economic freedom over the past 22 years. And as you can see, the higher the score, the lower the corruption, and the higher the score in economic freedom, the less the corruption, and the lower the score in economic freedom, the more the corruption. Economic relationship, GDP per person, 2020, international dollars. As you can see, the higher the level of economic freedom, and there's a fairly tight relationship there, the higher the level of prosperity. Now, GDP is the whole of the economy divided up on a per person basis. We'll now look at personal income. In other words, this is the amount of money people get to take home once they've paid their taxes and so on. And again, a very strong relationship between economic freedom and people's personal income. So what do you find? Well, I talked about the dynamic that increases prosperity and productivity. In economically free countries, you find much higher standards of literacy. You find much lower levels of poverty and much higher levels of affluence. So let's look at Ghana and economic freedom. These are Ghana's ranks. Overall, Ghana ranks 113 out of the 165 nations or jurisdictions we measure in the Economic Freedom Index. That's a pretty poor rank, but actually, and I probably won't have time to go into this, Ghana has been improving in economic freedom, and its economic performance has been improving in economic freedom. The 113th rank looks pretty poor, but it's actually a reason for hope. When the rank in economic freedom is that low, a set of fundamental reforms can raise Ghana quickly and supercharge the economy. I don't have time to go through the ranks, but I'll make a very quick thing. Talking earlier about business regulations, Ghana is 160th in the world in business regulations. In other words, piles and piles of red tape. You know, only nations like Iran and Venezuela are worse than Ghana in business regulations. Cut through some of that red tape and you'll be amazed at the vibrancy of the Ghanaian business sector in producing prosperity and jobs. Labor regulations tend to keep people out of the labor market. If those are removed, you can start bringing people into the formal economy. But 80% of Ghana's workers are in the informal economy, without protections, with limited opportunities to improve skills and thus gain higher incomes. And they're there because of business regulations that prevent businesses from growing, and labor regulations that in particular form a barrier to the poor and unskilled in entering the business market. This is Ghana's economic freedom score overall. Ghana's in light blue. And as you can see, in the last century, Ghana's economic freedom score was well below the Sub-Saharan Africa score. Ghana surpassed the Sub-Saharan Africa score in about the year 2000. Unfortunately, the progress has come to a halt, so hopefully this, Anemone, and the other groups will charge again Ghana's increase in prosperity. But notice that division at 2000, where Ghana surpasses the average economic freedom of Sub-Saharan Africa. In the period when Ghana had lower economic freedom than the average Sub-Saharan Africa, and by the way, you should have noticed from that both the Sub-Saharan Africa score in economic freedom and the Ghana score improved. Ghana's score just gained better. In that period, the rest of Sub-Saharan Africa grew by only 4%, and Ghana, with a much lower economic freedom score, actually saw economic losses up to the year 2000. People were getting poorer. Now, as Ghana surpassed the Sub-Saharan African average in economic freedom, so did its growth. Since the year 2000, Sub-Saharan Africa has grown by about a third economically. Ghana has doubled. That shows you the power of economic freedom working in Ghana and what you could do, what this nation could do with its open society and entrepreneurship, what you could do if economic freedom was extended to everyone in Ghana. I have about 40 more minutes of slides, but I think people would start throwing things at me if I carried on much longer, particularly since you're so great on keeping schedules. So just let me thank you very much, and thank the organizers, and thank Emmanuel and Richard and the marvelous team they have put together. Thank you.